I've been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years now. In that time, I've logged over 18,000 flight hours, crossed the Atlantic Ocean more times than I can accurately count, and navigated through some of the most challenging weather systems that Mother Nature has ever decided to throw at an airplane. I've seen lightning strike my cockpit window so close that the flash left spots dancing in my vision for minutes afterward. I've landed in crosswinds that would make most people sick just thinking about them, wrestling the yoke as gusts tried to flip us sideways on final approach. I've dealt with mechanical failures that required every ounce of training I'd ever received. Medical emergencies at 35,000 feet where I had to make life or death decisions while simultaneously flying a tube full of terrified passengers. And yes, I've even dealt with confused passengers who somehow thought the emergency exit was the bathroom door. 23 years of flying gives you stories. 23 years of flying gives you confidence. 23 years of flying makes you think you've seen just about everything this profession can throw at you. But nothing absolutely nothing in all those years and all those flights and all those experiences prepared me for what happened on October 14, 2023. My name is Ryan Mitchell. I'm 54 years old as I tell you this story. And I've been a captain for one of the largest airlines in the United States for the past 15 years. Before that, I spent 8 years as a first officer, working my way up through the ranks the way everyone does in this industry, flight by flight, hour by hour, proving yourself worthy of the left seat. I'm based out of Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, which is one of the busiest airports in the world. It means I've spent more time in the state of Texas than most native Texans. My wife Sarah and I raised our 2 kids in a suburb called about 20 minutes from the airport on a good traffic day, close enough that I could be home for dinner on turnaround days when the schedule cooperated. Far enough that the constant roar of jet engines taking off and landing didn't shake our windows at all, ours. Before I tell you what happened on that October day, I need to tell you about my son. Because without understanding what happened with Tyler, without understanding the journey our family went through in the 2 years before that flight, you won't understand why I was sitting in a cockpit praying to a 15-year-old Italian kid who died almost 2 decades ago. You won't understand why I believed something impossible was happening. You won't understand any of it. Tyler was our firstborn. He came into this world screaming at 3 in the morning at Baylor Medical Center, and honestly, he hasn't stopped challenging us since the moment they placed him in Sarah's arms. From the very beginning, he was different, not in a bad way, just in a way that kept us constantly on our toes. He was the kid who asked questions that had no answers. The kind of questions that would make you pause mid-dinner and realize you had no idea why the sky was blue or how gravity actually worked. He was the kid who took apart every electronic device in the house just to see how it worked, leaving a trail of disassembled remote controls and broken DVD players in his wake. By the time he was 10, he'd figured out how to put most of them back together. By the time he was 12, he could code better than most adults I knew, building little programs and games on his computer while his friends were still figuring out how to use social media. Sarah used to joke that we didn't raise Tyler, we just tried to keep up with him. There was truth in that joke. The kind of truth that made us laugh nervously because we genuinely didn't know what to do with a kid who was smarter than both of us combined in so many ways. But in the spring of 2022, something changed. Tyler was 16 then, a junior in high school, pulling straight A's in AP classes that would have made my head spin, seemingly destined for whatever future he wanted, and then almost overnight. At least that's how it felt too, as he went from being this bright, curious, somewhat annoying teenager to someone I barely recognized when I looked at him. He stopped coming out of his room. Not just spending more time there, like teenagers do, but actually refusing to emerge for meals, for family movie nights, for anything that required him to interact with the rest of us. His grades, which had always been excellent without him seeming to try very hard, started slipping. First AB here and there, then CS, then teachers calling to ask if everything was okay at home. He quit the robotics club that he'd helped found as a freshman. He stopped hanging out with his friends he'd had since elementary school, just stopped coming around. And when I asked Tyler about it, he'd just shrugged and say they were busy. When we'd ask him what was wrong, really sit him down and try to have those heart-to-heart conversations the parenting books tell you to have, he'd just shrugged and say he was tired. Always tired. Tired in a way that sleep didn't seem to fix. Tired in a way that worried us more with each passing week. Sarah and I did what any parents would do when they're watching their child disappear in front of their eye. We took him to doctors first, his pediatrician, then specialists, running blood tests and scans looking for some physical explanation that would give us something concrete to fight. We took him to therapists first, a counselor at his school, then a psychologist with a fancy office in downtown Dallas who charged more per hour than I made in a day. We had conversations that went nowhere and arguments that went everywhere. Voices raised in the kitchen at midnight, while Tyler sat upstairs in his dark room, not even bothering to put on headphones to block us out. I remember one night in particular, sitting in my truck in the driveway after a particularly brutal 3-day trip, just staring at the light in Tyler's window and wondering where we'd gone wrong. The house was quiet. Sarah was already asleep, exhausted from another day of trying to reach a son who didn't want to be reached, and I sat there in the dark, still in my uniform, too tired to go inside and face whatever version of my son would be waiting, wondering what we'd missed, what we could have done differently. Whether there was something broken in him that was our fault, some failure of parenting that had led to this boy who used to light up every room, now wanting nothing more than to sit alone in the dark. The therapist eventually diagnosed him with depression and anxiety, clinical terms that somehow made it both better and worse. Better because at least we had a name for it, a framework for understanding what was happening. Worse because depression and anxiety aren't things you can fix with surgery or antibiotics. There's no simple cure, no clear timeline for recovery, no guarantee that the kid you used to know will ever fully come back. She said it was more common than we thought, especially in kids who were highly intelligent and felt like they didn't quite fit in anywhere. She said Tyler's brain worked differently than most people's, and that difference that had made him so exceptional was also making him vulnerable. They put him on medication, a process of trial and error that took months, different pills with different side effects, some making him worse before they found the combination that made him stable. They gave us strategies. They told us to be patient. I'm not a patient man by nature. I'm a pilot! I'm trained to identify problems and solve them immediately. Because at 35,000 feet with a cabin full of passengers depending on you, you don't have the luxury of patience. You don't get to sit with a problem and let it develop. You assess. You decide. You act. That's how I've operated my entire adult life, and it served me well in the cockpit. But with Tyler, I had to learn. I had to learn to sit with my son in his darkness and not try to fix it with some checklist or procedure. I had to learn that sometimes the most powerful thing a father can do is simply be present, not offering solutions, not pushing for progress, just sitting on the floor outside his bedroom door and letting him know that whenever he was ready, I'd be there. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, and it was during this time, during these months of helplessness and fear and desperate hope, that Tyler found Carlo Acutis. I remember the day clearly. It's seared into my memory the way certain moments just are. The moments that divide your life into before and after. It was a Sunday afternoon in September 2022, and I'd just gotten home from a 3-day trip that had taken me to Seattle and back with a layover in Phoenix. I was exhausted. The kind of bone-deep tired that comes from sleeping in hotel rooms and waking up at 4 in the morning to catch cruise shuttles. All I wanted was a shower and maybe a nap before dinner. I walked into the kitchen to find Sarah crying at the table. My heart dropped after everything we'd been through. My first thought was that something had happened with Tyler, that he'd done something to hurt himself, that our worst fears had finally come true. But she looked up at me, and I realized these weren't sad tears. There was something else, entirely the kind of tears that come when you've been holding your breath for months, and finally get to exhale. Tyler showed me something, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of a hand. Come look. I followed her upstairs to Tyler's room, my heart still pounding even though her tears had told me this was something good. The door was open. That alone was remarkable, since it had been closed for months. Tyler was sitting at his desk, his laptop open to a website, and he turned around when we walked in. There was something in his face I hadn't seen in so long. I'd almost forgotten what it looked like. Light. Life. Engagement with the world beyond his own head. On the screen was the face of a teenage boy with dark hair and a warm smile, wearing what looked like a red polo shirt. He looked like any ordinary kid, maybe someone Tyler would have been friends with at school. The kind of kid you'd see at the mall or the movie theater and never look twice at. This is Carlo Acutis, Tyler said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in months. Interest. Engagement. Energy. He was Italian. He died when he was 15, from leukemia. I looked at the screen. 10 at my son. Genuinely confused about why a dead Italian teenager was making my wife cry happy tears in our son's bedroom. Tyler must have seen the confusion on my face because he kept talking, words tumbling out faster than I'd heard him speak in ages. He was really into computers, like me, like really into them. He taught himself to code when he was 9 years old. And he built websites. Not stupid websites, but actual important ones. He catalogued all these Eucharistic miracles from around the world, hundreds of them, made this whole database and exhibition that traveled to different countries. And he played video games and had a dog and was just normal, but also not normal at all. Tyler scrolled down the page and pointed to a quote displayed in elegant script. "To always be close to Jesus. That's my life plan." He said that, Tyler continued, and he meant it. He actually genuinely meant it. It wasn't just something he said because he was supposed to, he actually lived it. Every single day. Mass every day. Adoration every day. He'd get up early before school just to pray. And he wasn't weird about it. Wasn't preachy or annoying. He was just good. Really, really good. Now, I should tell you something about my family's faith, or lack thereof, at that point in our lives. I was raised Catholic, baptized as an infant, first communion at 7, confirmation at 14, the whole routine. Sarah was raised Catholic too, in a big Irish family in Boston where the church was as much a part of life as Sunday dinners and Red Sox games. We'd baptized both our kids and done the first communion thing when they were young, dragged them to CCD classes, even when they complained. But somewhere along the way, the faith had become more of a cultural habit than a living thing. We went to Mass on Christmas and Easter, stood in the back and went through the motions, checked the box, and went home. We said grace before Thanksgiving dinner. We had a crucifix on the wall that Sarah's mother had given us as a wedding gift. But that was about the extent of it. So when my depressed, anxious, computer-obsessed son started telling me about this Italian teenager who had been beatified by the Catholic Church, didn't even fully understand what beatified meant at that point. I didn't know what to think. Part of me was skeptical. The rational pilot's brain, wondering if this was some kind of unhealthy obsession. A depressed kid latching onto religion as an escape from reality. Part of me was just happy to see Tyler excited about something. Anything. After months of watching him drift through life like a ghost. And part of me, a small part that I didn't want to acknowledge, a part that I'd been suppressing since my own teenage years, was curious, genuinely curious, about what this dead kid had figured out that made him glow like that, even in a photograph. Over the following weeks and months, Tyler dove deep into everything Carlo Acutis. He learned about Carlo's life in Milan, growing up in a wealthy family that didn't quite know what to make of their unusually devout son. He learned how Carlo had taught himself to code by the age of 9, how he'd used his skills not for games or social media, but to create a website, the Eucharistic miracles around the world verified instances, where the bread and wine of communion had supposedly transformed into actual flesh and blood. He learned about Carlos's devotion to the Eucharist, how he'd called it his highway to heaven and gone to Mass every single day, arriving early to pray and staying late for adoration. Even as a young teenager, when most kids his age were sleeping in and playing video games, he learned about Carlo's kindness. 2 stories that didn't have anything to do with religion, but everything to do with the kind of person Carlo was. How he'd befriended the homeless people near his school, learning their names and their stories, bringing them food and sleeping bags without ever telling anyone about it. How he'd defended bullied kids in his class, standing up to populous students who were making someone's life miserable. How he'd tutored younger students in computer skills, patiently explaining concepts over and over until they understood. How everyone who knew him, from his family to his classmates to the doorman in his apartment building, described him the same way. Joyful, genuinely, radiantly, inexplicably joyful. And Tyler learned about Carlo's death, how the leukemia had come out of nowhere in October 2006, how Carlo had received the diagnosis and immediately offered his suffering for the Pope and for the Church, how he'd remained peaceful and even cheerful as his body failed, how he'd died on October 12th, those meal says just 3 days after entering the hospital. 15 years old, gone in less than 2 weeks. But what struck Tyler the most, I think, was Carlo's normalcy. This wasn't some medieval saint who lived in a cave and ate locusts and performed impossible miracles that seemed more like fairy tales than real events. This wasn't someone so distant from modern life that you couldn't relate to them at all. This was a kid who played video games, PlayStation specifically, which Tyler also played. This was a kid who loved his dog, a mixed breed named Bricio. This was a kid who used the internet and made jokes and worried about his grades and occasionally got in trouble for spending too much time on his computer. This was a kid who, according to everyone who knew him, was genuinely, radiantly happy, not because his life was perfect. Not because he never struggled, but because he'd found something worth living for. He'd found a purpose so big and so real that it made everything else fall into perspective. And slowly, gradually, something changed in my son. Tyler started going to Mass, not just on Sundays, but sometimes during the week too, getting up early before school to attend the 7 a.m. service at our parish. He started praying, really praying. Not just going through the motions. He started reading about the faith he'd been baptized into but never really understood, asking questions that I couldn't answer, questions that sent me to Google and Catholic websites, and eventually to conversations with our parish priest. He started smiling again. Real smiles, the kind that reached his eyes. I'm not saying Carlo Acutis cured my son's depression. I want to be absolutely clear about that. Tyler still takes his medicational combination that took months to get right but has helped stabilize his brain, chemistry in ways that prayer alone couldn't. He still sees his therapist every other week, like clockwork, working through the thought patterns and coping strategies that help him manage his anxiety. Mental health isn't something you pray away, and I'd never, ever suggest otherwise to anyone struggling with similar issues. But something shifted in Tyler after he discovered Carlo. Something fundamental changed. He found a framework for his Sephorian way to understand that his pain wasn't meaningless, that it could be offered up for something greater than himself. He found a model for how to live, not a perfect model, but a realistic one. A kid just like him who'd figured out how to be genuinely good in a modern world full of distractions and temptations. Found hope, real, tangible hope that the darkness wouldn't last forever. And watching my son come back to life, watching the light return to his eyes one day at a time, made me start paying attention to this teenage blessed in a way I never expected to pay attention to anything religious. In February 2023, Sarah and I took Tyler to Italy for his 18th birthday. It was his only request, the only thing he wanted, the only gift that mattered to him. He wanted to visit Assisi, where Carlo's body is kept in the church of Santa Maria. He wanted to see, with his own eyes, the boy who had helped save his life. I thought it was a strange birthday wish. Honestly, most kids turning 80 and want cars or money or parties or college trip deposits. Our kid wanted to fly across the Atlantic to visit a tomb, but after everything we'd been through, after 18 months of watching him suffer and slowly heal, I would have taken that kid to the moon if he'd asked. I would have done anything. The trip changed me. I didn't expect it. Tywin as Tyler's dad, as the guy paying for the flights and hotels, as a supportive parent, doing what supportive parents do. I didn't expect to have my own experience. I didn't expect anything at all, really, except to see my son happy. But standing in front of Carlo's tomb, in that small sanctuary in the Church of Santa Maria, looking at the body of this 15-year-old boy preserved behind glass, thing cracked open in my chest. Something I'd been keeping locked away for decades. He looked like he was sleeping. That's the thing that got me. The thing I couldn't shake. The image that stayed with me through all the months that followed. Carlo Acutis didn't look dead. He didn't look like a relic or a museum piece or a religious artifact. He looked like someone had just tucked him in for a nap. Like he might open his eyes at any moment and smile and ask what all the fuss was about. He was wearing jeans and a red polo shirt, the same outfit he'd been buried in, the clothes of a normal teenager. His face was peaceful, serene, and he looked like Tyler's age. That's what broke me. Standing there, looking at this dead boy who looked so much like my living son, I finally understood something I'd been resisting for years. This kid knew something I don't. This kid figured out something about life, about purpose, about God, that I've been missing for 53 years of going through the motions. I started crying in that church. Not quiet, dignified, tears-oogly crying, the kind that shakes your shoulders and makes you gasp for breath. Sarah held my hand. Tyler stood beside me with this expression on his face that I can only describe as recognition, like he understood exactly what was happening because it had happened to him too. I started praying to Carlo after that trip. Not formal prayers, I didn't know any specific devotions or novenas, just conversations. I talked to him in my car on the way to the airport, rolling through Predon Dallas traffic with the radio off, telling him about my day, my worries, my hopes. I'd talk to him in the hotel rooms during layovers in cities across America, lying in bed unable to sleep, asking him to watch over Tyler, to pray for my son the way his own mother surely still prayed for him. I'd talk to him in the cockpit during cruise, when the autopilot was engaged and there was nothing to do but watch the clouds roll by beneath us, monitor the instruments, and think. I told him about Tyler. I told him about my fears that the depression would come back, that we'd lose our son to the darkness that had almost claimed him. I told him about the doubts I had about my faith and my life and whether any of it meant anything in the grand scheme of things. I told him about the emptiness I'd been carrying since my own teenage years, the sense that I was going through the motions of a life I'd never really chosen. And I asked him, Ober and Ober, to pray for my son, to pray for my family too. Pray for me. I didn't expect anything miraculous to happen. I wasn't looking for signs or wonders or mystical experiences. I'm a pilot. I deal in facts and physics and checklists. I don't do magical thinking. I just found comfort in talking to someone who seemed to understand what it meant to be young and confused and searching for meaning in a world that didn't always make sense. But then came October 14th, 2023. It was a Saturday, and I was scheduled to fly the 8:45 a.m. departure from Dallas-Fort Worth to Denver International. It's a route I've flown hundreds of times, maybe more than any other route in my career. About 2 hours in the air. Usually smooth, nothing complicated. The kind of flight you could almost do in your sleep. Except you never do, because that's how people die in this profession. My first officer that day was a woman named Patricia, who went by Patty. She'd been flying with me for about 3 years at that point, and I trusted her completely, which is not something I say lightly about anyone I share a cockpit with. She was sharp, calm under pressure, and had a dry sense of humor that made long flights bearable. She'd come to aviation through the Air Force, done 2 tours overseas flying cargo planes into places I couldn't pronounce, and brought that military precision to everything she did. The weather briefing that morning was concerning, but not alarming. There was a line of thunderstorms developing to the northwest of Dallas, moving east-southeast. The forecast showed them clearing the airport area well before our departure time, or at least that's what the model suggested. And in aviation, you live and die by what the model suggests. Standard Texas autumn weather, really. Volatile, unpredictable, sometimes dangerous, but manageable with proper planning and respect. I arrived at the airport around 6:30 a.m., went through my usual routine, checked in with operations, reviewed the flight plan, looked over the maintenance logs for our aircraft. Everything was normal. The Boeing 737-800 we'd be flying was in perfect condition, no deferred maintenance items, no write-ups from the previous crew, no concerns whatsoever. We had 147 passengers booked, plus 5 crew members. Myself, Patty, and 3 flight attendants. Full flight, which wasn't unusual for a Saturday morning Denver run. Business travelers heading home. Families visiting relatives. College students returning to school. Around 7:30, I walked out to the gate to do my external inspection of the aircraft. This is something I've done thousands of times, a walk-around check where you visually inspect everything you can see from the ground. You check the tires for wear, the landing gear for hydraulic leaks, the engine intakes for debris or bird strikes, the control surfaces for damage or unusual wear. You look for anything that might be out of place, anything that might indicate a problem that the maintenance crews missed. That morning, the plane looked immaculate, spotless, evil, but I remember standing under the left wing, looking up at the massive engine, and feeling this strange weight in my chest. Not pain, nothing physical that I could identify, nothing that would have shown up on a medical exam, just heaviness, pressure, like something was pressing down on me from the inside, some invisible hand pushing against my sternum. I shook it off. I'm a pilot. We don't have time for vague feelings and undefined discomforts. We deal in checklists and procedures and concrete facts. If you can't put it in a report, it doesn't exist. I headed up to the cockpit, stowed my flight bag in the compartment behind my seat, and started going through the pre-flight procedures with Patty. We configured the flight management system with our route, ran through the originating checklist item by item, contacted clearance delivery for our initial routing. Everything by the book, everything normal. At 8:15, the gate agent called to tell us boarding had commenced. I could hear the passengers filing onto the aircraft through the open cockpit or the rustle of carry-on bags being shoved into overhead bins. The flight attendants directing people to their seats with practiced patience, a baby crying somewhere in the back of the plane, normal sounds, the soundtrack of my career, familiar as my own heartbeat. But that weight in my chest wouldn't go away. If anything, it was getting heavier with each passing minute. At 8:25, Patty looked over at me from the right seat. "You okay, Captain? You look a little pale." I forced a smile. "Just tired. Long week." She nodded, but I could tell from her expression that she wasn't entirely convinced. Patty knew me well enough to know when something was off, but she also knew me well enough to know that I wouldn't explain until I was ready. So she let it go and turned back to her instruments. At 8:30, the boarding door closed with its familiar the flight attendants completed their final safety checks. Walk in the aisle to ensure seatbacks were upright, tray tables stowed, seatbelts fastened. We got our final passenger count from the gate. 147 souls in the cabin, plus the 5 of us, 152 total. The gate agent wished us a good flight through the intercom, and we pushed back from the gate at 8:35. This is where things get strange. This is where my story stops being about standard procedures and weather briefings and starts being about something else entirely, as we taxied toward runway 18R, moving slowly through the maze of taxiways that make up DFW's sprawling complex. I felt an overwhelming urge to pray. Now, this wasn't unusual in itself. I'd been praying more since our trip to Assisi, talking to Carlo like he was a friend I'd never met. But this was different. This wasn't a casual conversation in my head, a friendly chat during cruise altitude. This was urgent, desperate, insistent in a way I'd never experienced before. It felt like someone was shaking me by the shoulders, like someone was screaming in my ear, even though I couldn't hear any words. Pay attention! Something's wrong. You need to pay attention right now. I kept my hands on the tiller, kept my eyes on the taxiway, followed the yellow line like I'd done thousands of times before. But in my mind, in whatever place exists between conscious thought and something deeper, I was talking to Carlo Carlo! I said silently. I don't know what's happening. I don't know why I feel this way. Why my chest is tight and my heart is racing and something is screaming at me that I can't identify. But if you can hear me, please pray for us. Pray for everyone on this airplane. Pray for my crew, whatever's coming, whatever I'm feeling. Please help us, please. We reached the hold short line for runway 18R at 8:41 a.m. There was one aircraft ahead of USA regional jet, AN Embraer, in the livery of a commuter carrier, and then we'd be cleared for takeoff. The tower estimated our wheel-stop time at 8:47, right on schedule. Maybe 8:48? Depending on the regional jet's takeoff roll. That's when I heard it. Not out loud, not through my headset or the cockpit speakers or any physical means of communication, but somewhere deep in my chest, in that place where the weight had been pressing down all morning. I heard a voice. Or not a voice exactly. I couldn't describe it as male or female, young or old, loud or soft. It was more like a thought that didn't come from me. A thought that arrived fully formed and absolutely certain, dropped into my consciousness like a stone into still water. Leave now. I blinked. I looked at Patty, who was reviewing something on her electronic flight bag, completely unaware that her captain was apparently losing his mind. She looked calm, professional, normal. Leave now. The thought came again, more insistent this time, pressing against my consciousness with an urgency that was almost painful. And with it came something else, not a vision exactly. Not an image I could see with my eyes, but a knowing. I knew, suddenly and completely and without any rational basis whatsoever, that we were in danger. I knew that we needed to be in the air. I knew that something terrible was coming, and we needed to get out of its way. I keyed my microphone. Tora, Delta 74, requesting immediate takeoff clearance. Patty's head snapped toward me. The regional jet ahead of us was still on the runway, maybe 1,000 feet into its takeoff roll, nowhere close to airborne yet. The tower controller's voice came back, professional but clearly confused by my request. Delta 724, stand by. Traffic on runway. Tower, Delta 724. I need priority clearance. Requesting intersection departure from taxiway Bravo, if available. Now Patty was staring at me openly, her eyes wide with a combination of confusion and concern. Ryan, she said, keeping her voice low even though the cockpit door was closed. What are you doing? I couldn't explain it to her. I couldn't explain it to myself. All I knew was that we needed to be in the air. We needed to be in the air right now. We needed to leave this runway, this airport, this spot of ground that was suddenly feeling like a trap. Tower, Delta 724. I'm declaring an emergency. Priority handling requested. The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them, before I could fully process what I was doing. Declaring an emergency is not something pilots do lightly. It's not something you do because you have a vague feeling or an unexplained weight in your chest. It triggers a cascade of responses, fire trucks rolling, supervisors notified, paperwork filed, investigations launched. Your airline will want to know what happened. The FAA will want to know what happened. Everyone will want to know what happened, and a dead Italian teenager told me to leave is not an answer that appears in any emergency procedures manual. But primera said italiano, and I meant it. There was a moment of silence on the frequency. A few seconds that felt like an eternity. I could imagine the controller up in the tower, looking at his scope, trying to understand why a perfectly routine flight was suddenly declaring an emergency before it even took off. Then, Delta 724. Roger, your emergency declaration. State nature of emergency. I hesitated. What could I say? What possible explanation could I give that would make sense to another professional? To someone trained in the same procedures and protocols I'd followed my entire career. Tower, Delta 724. Flight crew medical issue. Request immediate departure. It was Alia. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe something was medically wrong with me. Maybe I was having a stroke or a panic attack or a psychotic break. Maybe the stress of Tyler's illness had finally caught up with me. Maybe the months of worry had broken something in my brain. All I knew was that I needed to get this aircraft off the ground. And if lying to air traffic control was what it took, then I was willing to face the consequences later. The controller came back, his voice all business now. Delta 724, cleared for immediate takeoff runway 18R. Traffic will hold. Winds 180 at... I advanced the throttles before he finished speaking. Patty grabbed my arm. Ryan. What the hell is going on? What medical issue? I looked at her, this woman I'd trusted with my life in the cockpit for 3 years. This professional I respected more than almost anyone I'd ever flown with, and I told her the truth, or as much of it as I could in the seconds before we needed to be airborne. I don't know, I said. I can't explain it, but something is very wrong, and we need to leave right now. Please, Patty, I need you to trust me. She held my gaze for a long moment. 23 years of flying hadn't prepared either of us for this moment, the captain acting on an inexplicable hunch. The first officer being asked to go along with something that violated every procedure we'd ever been trained on. Her hand was still on my arm. I could see her mind working, calculating the risks, weighing her options. And then she nodded. She released my arm, turned back to her instruments, and said, "Your aircraft." My aircraft, I confirmed. We accelerated down runway 18R, the engines roaring behind us, the landscape of Dallas-Fort Worth blurring past my window. V1, Patty called as we passed the commit speed rotate. I pulled back on the yoke, and we were airborne at 8:40 a.m. 7 minutes early, as we climbed through 3,000 feet, I banked the aircraft to the left. Following our standard departure procedure, turning northwest before we'd hook back around toward Denver. And that's when I saw it. To the northwest, maybe 5 miles from the airport, the sky had turned black. Not storm cloud, like I've seen plenty of storms in my career, seen the dark anvil tops of thunderheads from both above and below. This was different. This was darker, more concentrated, more wrong. It looked like someone had punched a hole in the atmosphere and let something terrible pour through. "Jesus Christ!" Patty whispered. We watched as the darkness descended, a pillar of wind and destruction dropping from the sky like the finger of God if God were angry. If God wanted to smash something flat. The microburst hit the airport at 8:47 a.m. For those who don't know what a microburst is, let me try to explain it in terms that make sense. A microburst is essentially a bomb made of air. It's a column of rapidly descending wind that can drop from the base of a thunderstorm and hit the ground with devastating force winds that can exceed 150 miles per hour, arriving without warning and dissipating within minutes. When the column hits the ground, it spreads outward in all directions, creating wind shear that can flip an aircraft upside down in less time than it takes to react. Aircraft have crashed because of people have died. 168 people on Delta Flight 191 at this very airport in 1985. When a Lockheed L-1011 encountered a microburst on final approach and crashed on the airport grounds, that disaster led to the development of new wind shear detection equipment, new pilot training programs, new procedures for avoiding exactly this kind of weather phenomena. But no amount of equipment or training can save you if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. No amount of procedures can protect you if the microburst lands right on top of you. The one that hit DFW that morning was later classified as one of the most severe ever recorded in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Wind speeds exceeded 130 miles per hour. The column descended directly onto runway 18, the runway we had been scheduled to depart from at 8:47. The exact time, the exact location. If we had waited for our normal clearance, if I hadn't declared that emergency, we would have been on that runway at full throttle, maximum weight, trying to lift off. At the precise moment, the microburst hit. The investigators later calculated, using flight data recorders and meteorological models, that the wind shear would have slammed our aircraft back into the ground before we ever got airborne. At full fuel load, with 152 people on board, there would have been no survivors. But we weren't there, because I had listened to a voice I couldn't explain. Because I had trusted an urging that had no rational basis. Because I had prayed to a dead Italian teenager and somehow he had heard me. We were at 4,000 feet and climbing, safely removed from the chaos unfolding below. The radio exploded with traffic. Emergency vehicle scrambling. Controllers redirecting aircraft, their voices tight with professional calm that couldn't quite hide their alarm. Pilots reporting the mushroom cloud of dust and debris rising from the airport, visible from miles away. A cargo plane that had been on final approach was forced to go around. Its crew reporting that they'd dropped nearly 1,000 feet in seconds before regaining control. Their aircraft pitched and rolled by winds that shouldn't have been there. The regional jet that had been ahead of us, the one that had just taken off before we requested emergency clearance, was caught on the edge of the microburst. They made it, barely. But the pilot later told investigators it was the most terrifying experience of his 30-year career. His aircraft was thrown sideways, nearly inverted, before he managed to wrestle it back under control. Passengers were screaming. Flight attendants were thrown against the cabin walls. It was, he said, like being inside a washing machine at 35,000 horsepower. And us, we felt nothing. We were climbing smoothly through clear air. Our passengers probably wondering why we'd taken off a few minutes early. The chaos below is visible but distant, like watching a disaster movie through a window. The smoothest takeoff of my career, followed by the smoothest climb, followed by 2 hours of uneventful cruise at 35,000 feet. Patty turned to me about 20 minutes into the flight, when we'd leveled off and the autopilot was doing most of the work. Her face was pale, her hands still trembling slightly. "How did you know?" I didn't have an answer, not one that would make sense. Not one that would satisfy a professional pilot trained in the same facts and physics worldview. I've lived in my entire career, so I just shook my head and kept flying. We landed in Denver 2 hours later without incident. Normal approach, normal landing, normal taxi to the gate. But when we arrived at the jet bridge and the passengers began to streaming past the cockpit door with their carry-ons and their relieved smiles and their complete ignorance of how close they'd come to dying, I sat in my seat and couldn't move. My hands were shaking. My vision was blurry with tears. I hadn't realized I was crying. I sat there, still in my harness, still in my headset, while the flight attendants did their final checks and the gate agent came aboard to chat, and eventually everyone realized that the captain wasn't coming out of the cockpit. Patty put her hand on my shoulder. "Ryan," she said quietly, "you saved us." "Whatever happened? However you knew? Saved 152 people today?" I finally looked at her. "It wasn't me," I said. "I need you to understand that. Whatever happened today, it wasn't me. I didn't know anything. I just listened to something. To someone. She didn't ask what I meant. Maybe she didn't want to know. Or maybe, on some level, she already understood. We'd been flying together long enough that she'd heard me mention Carlo Acutis once or twice, knew that I'd taken my son to Italy, knew that something had changed in me since that trip. Maybe she put the pieces together. Maybe she decided she didn't need to. The investigation that followed was the most surreal experience of my professional life. The FAA wanted to know why I had declared an emergency. The airline wanted to know why I had deviated from standard procedures. The tower controller wanted to know how I had known something was wrong before any of their instruments. Detected the developing microburst because none of their equipment had shown anything unusual until seconds before impact. Far too late for a normal response. I told them the truth, or as much of it as I could without sounding completely insane. I told them I had experienced a strong intuition that something was wrong, an overwhelming feeling that I couldn't ignore. I told them I had felt an urgent need to depart early, that every instinct I'd developed over 23 years of flying was screaming at me to get off that ground. I told them I couldn't explain it in technical terms, but that I had trusted my instincts, and those instincts had been correct. They weren't satisfied, of course. Nobody's satisfied with intuition when they're trying to fill out an official report, when they're looking for the checklist item or sensor reading or procedural step that explains why a pilot did what he did. But what else could they do? The facts spoke for themselves. A deadly microburst had struck the exact location where our aircraft would have been. At the exact time we would have been there. We had departed 7 minutes early. Everyone survived. In the end, they classified it as a case of crew resource management excellence. A fancy way of saying the captain had a good gut feeling and acted on it and moved on to other cases. I kept my job, I kept my license. I kept it flying. Because what else was I going to do? This is my life. This is what I know how to do. But I know, and Patty knows, and now you know, that it was something more. I didn't tell my family the full story until that night. After we landed in Denver, I had to fly a deadhead flight back to Dallas, sitting in the cabin as a passenger, wearing my uniform, watching another crew do the job I'd done 1,000 times. It felt strange, surreal, like I was a ghost watching my own life from the outside. Sarah was waiting for me in the kitchen when I finally walked through our front door around 11 that night. Her face was worried. She'd seen the news about the mic, heard about the airport chaos, but I hadn't been able to reach me all day because my phone had died and I hadn't thought to charge it or borrow someone else's. I sat down at the kitchen table and told her everything. The weight in my chest, the prayer, the voice, the impossible certainty that we needed to leave immediately. And as I talked, watching her face change from worry to wonder to something I can only describe as recognition, I realized I was crying again. Couldn't seem to stop. "It was Carlo," she said when I finished. Not a question, a statement of fact, as simple and certain as anything she'd ever said. I nodded. I couldn't speak anymore. She took my hands in hers. "He heard you, Ryan. All those times you've been talking to him, asking him to watch over us. He heard you." Tyler came downstairs a few minutes later, drawn by the sound of voices, or maybe by something else. Some intuition of his own. When we told him what happened to Microburst, the emergency departure, the 7 minutes that separated 152 people from death, he didn't seem surprised. Just smiled. That smile I'd been so afraid I'd never see again, and said, "That's what saints do, Dad. That's literally what they do." I've been back to Assisi twice since the incident went about 3 months later. Once on the first anniversary of the flight. Both times, I stood in front of Carlo's tomb, looking at that peaceful face behind the glass, and I said thank you. I told him about the passengers I'll never meet, but whose lives were changed because of him. I told him about the grandmother in seat 14A who was flying to Denver to meet her first grandchild, a little girl named Emma, who would have grown up never knowing her grandmother if we'd been on that runway 7 minutes later. I told him about the college student in seat 22, who was heading home for fall break. A kid not much older than Carlo was when he died. A kid with his whole life ahead of him. I told him about the businessman in seat 3B who has since reconnected with his estranged daughter, having realized during the news coverage of the near disaster how close he'd come to never having the chance to make things right. I told him about Tyler, who graduated high school last spring and is now studying computer science at a Catholic university in Indiana. He wants to build websites, just like Carlo did. He wants to use technology to spread faith, just like Carlo did. He's still taking his medication. He's still seeing his therapist. But he's also still praying, still going to Mass, still talking about the teenage saint who showed him that holiness isn't about being perfect, it's about being present. Some nights, when I can't sleep, I pull up the flight data from that day. It's all there in black and white, the cold facts of what happened. Pushback, 8:35. Emergency declaration, 8:38. Takeoff. Clearance. 8:39. Wheels up. 8:40. Microburst. Impact. 8:47. 7 minutes. 420 seconds. The width of a hair in the timeline of eternity, but enough to hold 152 human lives. Coincidence? Some people say. Good instincts? Pilot's intuition honed over decades of experience. Maybe they're right. Maybe that's all it was. But I was there. I felt the weight in my chest. I heard the voice that didn't come from me. I experienced a certainty that had no rational basis, but turned out to be absolutely correct. And I know with every fiber of my being that, on October 14th, 2023, a blessed young man who died of leukemia in Italy in 2006 reached across the veil between heaven and earth and told a tired old pilot to leave early. 152 people went home to their families that day, because a teenage boy in heaven heard my prayer. Carlo Acutis famously said, "The Eucharist is my highway to heaven." As a pilot, that metaphor hits different for me now. Every time I taxi onto a runway, every time I advance those throttles and feel the power of the engines pushing us toward the sky, I think about highways. I think about the paths we choose and the paths that choose us. I think about the 7 minutes that separated my passengers from eternity. And I think about the voice that told me to leave. I've been flying for 23 years. I expect I'll fly for another 7 or 8 before I hit mandatory retirement age. Every flight I complete now feels like a gift. Every landing I make feels like a small miracle. And every time I taxi past runway 18R at DFW, I remember what almost happened there. And I whisper a prayer of thanks to a boy who never got to grow old, but who, apparently, is still very much at work. People sometimes ask me if I've become some kind of religious fanatic since the incident. The answer is no, not in the way they probably imagine. I didn't quit my job to become a monk. I didn't start preaching on street corners. I'm still the same guy I always was in most ways. Still impatient, still stubborn. Still more comfortable in a cockpit than a church pew. But something fundamental shifted in me on October 14th, 2023. I stopped living like I had all the time in the world. I stopped taking things for granted. My wife's patience, my son's recovery, my own beating heart. I started paying attention to the small miracles that happen every day, the ones we usually miss because we're too busy worrying about schedules and deadlines. I started going to Mass every Sunday, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. I wanted to sit in that pew and remember that I'm part of something bigger than myself. I wanted to receive the Eucharist Carlos highway to heaven and feel connected to that endless chain of believers stretching back 2,000 years. Sarah says, I'm a better husband now. More present. More. More willing to put down my phone and actually listen. Maybe staring death in the face does that to a person, strips away all the nonsense and leaves you with what actually matters. Tyler is thriving. He's carrying a 3.8 GPA in his computer science program. He's made friends who share his faith and interests. And he's started a campus group dedicated to studying young saints like Carlo Acutis. He calls me every Sunday night, and we talk for at least an hour. These conversations are the highlight of my week. The flight attendants from that day still send me Christmas cards. All three of them, Maria, Jennifer, and Danielle. They don't know the full story of never told anyone outside my family about the voice, the prayer, but they know something happened. Maria named her daughter Emma Ryan after me. I cried when she told me, and Patty, we still fly together sometimes. We don't talk about what happened very often, but every now and then, when we're cruising at altitude, she'll look over at me and just nod, and I'll nod back. We know what we know. I don't know why I was chosen to be part of this story. Maybe it was because of Tyler B, because Carlo felt a connection to another computer-loving kid struggling to find his way. Maybe I was finally ready to listen. Maybe it was just God's plan, mysterious and beautiful. What I do know is this: on October 14th, 2023, I was supposed to die. So were 151 other people. And we didn't. We're still here, still breathing, still living our beautiful lives, because a 15-year-old boy who loved Jesus and computers heard a prayer and decided to answer it. That's my story. Believe it or don't, I can't make that choice for you. But if you're ever in a desperate moment, if you're feeling that weight in your chest that tells you something is wrong, remember you're not alone. Remember that help is available from places you might not expect. Remember that the saints are real and they're listening. Dr. Carlo, he's listening. I know because he listened to me. Every morning when I wake up now, the first thing I do is thank God for another day. Then I thank Carlo, my friend, my intercessor, the teenager who saved my life and the lives of 151 strangers. I keep a small picture of him in my flight bag, right next to the photos of Sarah and Tyler. Sometimes, during long flights, I take it out and look at his face. That ordinary, extraordinary face, and I remember. 7 minutes, 152 lives, one blessed boy who loved Jesus more than anything else in the world. That's the miracle of Carlo Acutis, and I got to be part of it. If this story touched your heart, consider asking for Blessed Carlo Acutis' intercession in your own life. Subscribe to this channel, leave a like, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story of faith, hope, and the miraculous ways God works in our world.